Tonight on PrimeTime Politics, talking pipelines.
If we do get to an agreement with the federal government, we'll certainly let you know. But I remain very hopeful as our negotiations continue.
With Alberta and Ottawa negotiating over energy, how will the Prime Minister navigate possible changes to the BC tanker ban? Our strategists weigh in. Also, gambling over the airwaves. More than 40 senators want a ban on advertising for sports betting. One of those senators, Marty Deacon, tells us why. And arguing for the positive side of public life. Former Cabinet Minister Sergio Marchi talks about his new book and getting more young Canadians into the political arena. This is PrimeTime Politics. Hello, I'm Andrew Thompson with you tonight. Michael Serapio is on assignment. We're waiting to see what an Alberta federal agreement on energy could look like, especially when it comes to pipelines. Today, the Alberta Premier says she remains hopeful of a deal. But Danielle Smith says expanding the Trans Mountain pipeline and allowing more tanker traffic to move that oil is not enough. That's even though the plan has support from the BC government.
So my view is that the world is going to need more oil in particular. OPEC has now said it's probably 125 million barrels a day by 2050. And we need to be a growing share of that growing market, especially since we are going to have the lowest carbon intensity barrels. So I would say Premier Eby and I agree on a lot of things. And one of them is that we agreed on dredging the second Narrows to increase capacity, and we agree on expanding Trans Mountain pipeline as well. But as you can see, I would like to see expansions in all direction.
Meanwhile, in Ottawa, there's more pressure on the federal government over the tanker ban off BC's northern coast, with Conservatives accusing Liberals of a double standard.
As we speak, the U.S. crude oil tanker California is traveling from Tacoma to Alaska along that west coast. Why are the Liberals keeping in a law that prevents Canada from exporting our oil while U.S. tankers travel through the exact same place?
I know the honourable member across the aisle is not happy, but the Premier of Alberta has said she's quite supportive of what we're doing and is looking forward to finishing the conversations with the Prime Minister.
All right, for more, let's bring in our strategist panel. Joining us now is Susan Smith, a Liberal strategist, also a co-founder and principal at Blue Sky Strategy Group. Also here, you see Cole Hogan, a Conservative strategist. Welcome once again to you both.
Thanks for having us. So
I want to start with this pipeline story on Parliament Hill, the idea that an agreement between Alberta and the federal government could include this potential carve-out of the BC tanker ban. We've heard from BC Liberals talking about this. They're really focusing on the fact that the BC government and First Nations need to have their say on this, that there needs to be consent. We've heard a former Cabinet Minister, Karina Gold, saying, look, there was big public demand for this tanker ban when it came in. So, Susan, as this story moves forward, is there a risk for the Prime Minister within his own caucus if this does indeed come to pass when it comes to that ban?
It's not an uncomplicated question. The BC economy is in the toilet at the moment, but what the Prime Minister has said for any major projects that go forward, there has to be the consultation process with all relevant parties, and the relevant parties in this include the BC government and includes coastal First Nations. So before anything can happen, well, there isn't a project yet, there isn't a proponent yet, but when and if those things get identified, then a proper consultation process will have to happen. I don't think anybody can reasonably expect unanimity on anything. We're not unanimous around our kitchen tables typically when we have a conversation about things. But I think there'll have to be proper consultation. And I think you're already hearing Scott Moe weigh in, Danielle Smith, Premier Eby. So I think there will be a very high, intense level of discussion that takes place, and maybe a ground level, a ground level discussion takes place. So I think it'll be a while before you see resolution and a path.
Okay, so yeah, it's a long-lasting story. It could go on for a while. But Cole, weigh in on this, on the pressure the Prime Minister might face within his own party, not just from BC MPs, but also progressive MPs who might not like this idea of any kind of change to that tanker ban.
Sure. I think there's a few things at play here that are very interesting to watch. One, I think it's a good thing that the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, and the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, have a solid, productive working relationship right now. We've seen Danielle Smith say that, in her opinion, Justin Trudeau really accelerated the feelings of Western alienation and Western independence in Alberta, but that Mark Carney could address this by bringing in some new national energy projects from Alberta to the coast, to bring in some new pipeline projects. But as we've mentioned, what will be the opposition in Mark Carney's Liberal caucus? The prime suspect for such a thing would be someone like Stephen Guilbeault, who has said we have enough pipeline infrastructure, we don't need any more. But the fact of the matter is, oil and gas does pay the bills in this country. It pays for healthcare, it pays for social programs, and when we're in this substantial of financial dire straits, I think that's the kind of project we need to get going, and we'll see if the Liberals oppose that.
Okay, Susan, you talked about the various parties at play here, the BC government, First Nations, other premiers. Certainly, look, Alberta is not necessarily a key to Liberal fortunes electorally, but Danielle Smith has said, look, this is a matter of national unity when it comes to pipelines. So do you see a scenario where the Prime Minister might eventually have to pick a side if BC and Alberta stay at loggerheads on this?
I think the Prime Minister is wise enough to let the process take its course, and I think Canadians don't want to be held hostage by any one premier, and the unity of the country should never be held hostage by one premier. We've fought back as a country against that when there were premiers in Quebec. At that point in time, Canadians and Albertans, quite frankly, will fight back against that if Premier Smith tries to paint this in this light, and I think she probably will. But Canadians are reasonable people. They expect reasonable discussion to take place. They're not big on hammers being dropped, whether it's from a premier or a prime minister. And so I think the process will have to play out. What the Prime Minister set up with Bill C-5 and the major projects exercise is to be able to get to a yes or a no a lot more quickly. Just because you make the list doesn't mean you get passed, because the consultations and the discussions and the environmental processes have to take place. So that's what I look forward to seeing. If we can get it done, let's get it done. But if it doesn't work through the process that's been put out, then they have to find something else to do.
And Cole, if it can get done, what would it mean for resetting the relationship between Alberta and the federal government, between a Conservative Premier and a Liberal Prime Minister, especially with all the talk that we've been hearing over the past several months about Alberta sovereignty?
Well, yeah, I think there's, I agree with Danielle Smith that I think it would address some concerns and some Alberta independence sentiment in the West, but we're seeing some shifting political terrain just generally where the Premier of Alberta has a better relationship with the Liberal Prime Minister than the NDP Premier of British Columbia. And what's interesting here is, I have to reference, I did have the privilege of going to school at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon, where I took multiple constitutional law classes. And so that allows me to say one thing that BC NDP Premier David Eby won't say, and that is multiple, when there is an energy project that crosses multiple provincial boundaries, that's the federal government's jurisdiction as per the Constitution. So David Eby has no real constitutional or legal grounds to oppose any pipeline project going through his province, and I think he's holding the country back because of it.
I think it's a false premise, though, to put the entire relationship of Canada and Alberta on a project that involves the provinces, the First Nations, environmental assessments. I don't actually think that's fair or reasonable. Canadians don't see the world in black and white. They want due process. They want transparency on process. And to hinge the country and the future of the country on whether Danielle Smith's going to get her way or not, and whether she's going to stomp her feet and tip the monopoly game over. I think that's not a responsible way to view the country, and I think we have to be careful when we're talking about this project to say that there are multiple players in this for good reason.
Yeah, if I could just jump on Susan's point for a second, I think for Alberta in particular, they saw the last 10 years of the Justin Trudeau government as pretty antagonistic towards Alberta and not friendly towards the natural resource and energy sector. So seeing Mark Carney's government, and they've been trying to differentiate themselves from the Trudeau record with a lot of their announcements and in style and tone. So moving forward on an energy project, particularly an oil and gas pipeline, would send a message to any aggrieved Albertan that, look, this isn't the Justin Trudeau Liberals, and I'd commend them for doing so.
Okay, I want to turn to the situation in the House of Commons. We, of course, had that confidence vote earlier this week, a very close vote. It took opposition MPs abstaining to keep the government from being defeated on the budget. We did hear the government House Leader, Stephen McKinnon, this week say that, yes, this Parliament is still sustainable in its current form. We're going to keep working away. Susan, do you think the government is in a sustainable situation right now?
I don't think anybody wants the election, and proof was in the pudding this week. Pierre Poilievre doesn't want an election. He just won a seat because he lost the whole election and he lost his whole seat. He doesn't want to go back to the polls. He's got a leadership right now. And if he went to the polls, I think his math is that the Conservatives would not fare better in this snapshot and moment in time. The same applies to the NDP. They're leaderless, bank accountless, and a leadership isn't coming forward till March. And they don't likely look like they could end up in a better place. The Bloc Québécois may be a different story. So no opposition, none of those opposition parties want to trigger an election. Nobody wants one, which leads me to conclude that Parliament will continue. And opposition parliaments actually do get things done because there's horse trading. If the Conservatives want a pipeline, don't defeat the government. If, you know, or if there's other things that want to move ahead, and I think they're going to have to look on a case-by-case basis, which is typically how minority governments work anyway. So I think it is sustainable for a time because it was clear that no opposition party, certainly no party, I would argue the Liberals don't want to trigger an election either. Canadians will punish whoever pulls that trigger at this point in the game.
Cole, how do you see this? Because as Susan mentions, you've got a Conservative leader facing a leadership review. You've got an NDP that's not picking its leader until late March. So are we in a bit of a holding pattern, a fairly sustainable, regular situation on Parliament Hill for the next several months?
Yeah, I would say so. And I agree with Susan in parts here, too. Like, the polling right now is as close as it was towards the end of the election we just had in April. So not dissimilar from the difference between 2019 and 2021. If we had an election today, it would be pretty similar to the result we have right now. So I think that the Liberals generally, they want to get some more wins in the window before they go back to the electorate in the next election. But I think one thing that they also have in mind is that, you know, Donald Trump will be president until January 2029. I think the Liberals would very much like to have an election before Donald Trump is gone. The current base of the Liberal Party, their current voters, that's their #1 concern. So if they still have Trump there, even if they completely mismanage the Canada-U.S. relationship, the Trump issue still animates enough of their base that they would want to go to an election on this issue again. But I think in the meantime, in terms of the composition of the House of Commons, I think that we're going to see every party tiptoe around all the confidence votes.
Last word to you, Susan.
This is the Conservative take on how Pierre Poilievre's unfavorables are at 60% right now. And if you went to the polls, he hasn't made anybody like him anymore. He's lost an MP to a floor crossing. Another longtime member of his caucus is leaving. So the Conservatives will say, look over here. But Mr. Poilievre has his own problems at the moment, and that's one of the key reasons why he doesn't want to go to the polls.
Okay, we'll leave it there for now. Susan Smith, Cole Hogan, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Well, if you're a sports fan in Canada, chances are you'll run into ads for sports betting. But many senators want the federal government to hit the stop button on those ads. More than 40 have written the Prime Minister. They're calling for a ban on all advertising for sports gambling apps and websites. Ontario Senator Marty Deacon is a co-author of that letter and joins me now. Senator, good to see you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Andrew.
So let's start here with why exactly are you and your colleagues asking for that ban from the federal government?
Sure. As you know, we have a bill. We have a bill happening parallel and at the same time related to pulling in the reins on advertising. Senators felt very, very strongly that we want to keep this moving and keep pushing this forward as strong as we can with the government, and wanted to really make sure that we were keeping the attention and the seriousness of it. And the consensus was, let's try a full ban. Let's try a full ban with the Prime Minister's letter. That's a little bit different than what we're doing in the legislation.
Now, your letter calls this a public health issue, yes, similar to cigarette advertising. Walk us through that. What exactly is the research saying about the influx of sports gambling that's happening and the effects of that, and in terms of how that relates to the advertising? Thank
you. That's a good question, Andrew. As time has gone on and we have more and more Canadian data, this openness, this proliferation of advertising might be just a distraction for you, a distraction for me, like an annoyance. But for young people, it is becoming really, really, really negative on their own behavior, their mental health, and the development of addictions. We are carrying on the last year or two building much more data on this, particularly youth and particularly young males, sort of 14 to 34. There's a real uptick there, and there is this sort of dopamine rush of betting. I can win again. This is my sports celebrity telling me, and it really becomes a very serious addiction with consequences. And we've also learned each person that's impacts about 7 or 8 people around them.
So how would a ban on ads help fight these trends? Because you even say in your letter that, quote, we cannot legislate away human weakness, and gambling has been around for a long time.
That's right. So if we have a ban or a ban on advertising, that takes away, particularly for that age group, the access, the push in their face, the relentless reminder, the relentless invite, the relentless possibility that isn't really possible. And so we're trying to take that away and see, there's countries that have tried that, and see if it helps us along the way. That's a full ban. And again, to clarify, we have learned different things that can be done from an advertising aspect to reduce the exposure, which is critical right now.
I want to talk to you a bit about the arguments that the gaming industry puts forward on this, because they say, look, fewer kids are watching TV, fewer kids are watching sports on TV, that the number of ads in Canada have been trending down since the single game betting came into place 4 years ago. The Gaming Association of Canada says that the negative response to this advertising is predominantly emotional. So what's your answer to that pushback?
Yeah, and thank you for that. I have met with Gaming Association folks. They're an important part of this conversation and bring important perspective. Our data tells us things that are very, very different. We look at we take time analysis from games. It could be a hockey playoff, could be a basketball playoff, whatever it is. It tells us the proliferation of ads, the access for these young people. The TV may not be their #1 priority, but in their pocket is a phone, which is now their traveling casino. And that also attracts repeated betting. That's different than when you're getting in a car and driving to a casino.
Okay, I want to ask you about something else the Canadian Gaming Association has said, which is that, look, these ads are already regulated, provinces are overseeing gambling, and that federal action like what you're proposing would just cause more duplication. Ontario, for instance, does have that ban on athletes appearing in ads unless they promote responsible gaming. So why do you think the federal government needs to step in here?
Well, we have a country from coast to coast to coast, and in this environment, when we're looking at something that impedes health the way that we're learning this does, we need a national framework. We need to know that regardless of where you live in Canada, coast to coast to coast, that your health, the vulnerable people are protected. And so we have right now a patchwork. We have parts of the country who get exposure to the ads, but don't live in Ontario. We have different things going on across the country. Some have stuck to their gaming, traditional provincial gaming lotteries, out of protecting health. Why wouldn't we have a common standard like we do in cannabis and tobacco and alcohol?
So what have you heard then? Have you heard anything from the government, from the Prime Minister's office on this, the letter you wrote to them, about whether there's an appetite for this? Because there was one survey last year that found about 60% of Canadians favored an immediate nationwide ban on these commercials. So there does seem to be a public appetite for it, but we haven't seen any action. So what have you heard, and why do you think it's taking this long to actually do something?
So to make sure we have the common understanding in both of these processes, the letter has only been sent in the last 24 hours. And so we will get a response, and we hope to get a response soon. And that we have not received yet. Have we had conversations with different government people, ministers? We're continually talking about this, the government, the House, and in the Senate. That's that piece. The bill, as you probably know, has been approved twice now in the Senate with 100% support, and it's now in the House, and it's had its first reading. So that is also progressing. Those are two things. The goal is to get action as fast as we can, so we're not going through another season of our young people being vulnerable and exposed.
Okay, you mentioned that bill, and I do want to finish up on that legislation, because as you say, it's now gone from the Senate to the House of Commons. What's your sense of what the uptake is going to be among MPs from different parties about actually getting that legislation passed on that side of Parliament?
Well, the bill itself, we've seen so far, is not it's a nonpartisan bill. We've had the support, and we hope to see the same thing in the House. Now, we're in interesting times, there's no question, but we hope to see that same support. And the same kind of conversations and consultation and collaboration that happened in the Senate are now beginning in the House. So everybody understands all aspects of this, accurate information, and now we're working together with other countries to get this right in the best way it can be.
Okay, we'll certainly keep watching the story. Senator Marty Deacon, appreciate your time on this.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Sergio Marchi has certainly seen politics up close over the years. He was a longtime Liberal MP, a cabinet minister, and an ambassador. And before all that, he was involved in local politics in Toronto. That experience is helping to inform Marchi's new book, Pursuing a Public Life: How to Succeed in the Political Arena. He sat down with Michael Serapio to talk about the positive side of being in that arena, even in today's climate. Here's a look.
Sergio Marchi, thank you for joining us. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
So obviously you believe in the value of a public life, hence what you have put together here over the last 2 years. But you know, I'm thinking to a year ago where nothing was getting done here in Ottawa. And that was essentially because of partisan games, political bickering. And at the end of the day, when you consider these political times versus when you were a cabinet minister, you know, public life has become more toxic. Is this too hard of a call to tell Canadians to get involved in a process that has, quite frankly, turned a lot of Canadians off?
Yeah, you're right. I think, and it's not just Canada, I think when you look across the globe, politics has become more polarized, more divisive, and quite frankly, more nasty. And it does turn Canadians off, and it discourages people from thinking about a public life career, which this book is all about. I'm concerned that particularly young Canadians are giving public life a pass. In fact, if you look at our House of Commons today, barely 3% of the MPs are under 30. And so the combination is very worrying. So I thought, let me put pen to paper and see if we can make it a little more encouraging and easier for young Canadians to enter, serve, and hopefully survive the political arena.
Okay, so what's the danger then? I get the observation you're making. Not enough young people are involved in the political process right now, but what's the danger of that?
Well, I think the danger is that we don't get the talented people, the young, the energetic, good ideas, new ideas. I mean, the whole issue is that artificial intelligence has incredible potential, but AI won't run a country. AI won't provide people with empathy, and it won't safeguard our values. What we will always need is political leadership. Good people, bold voices, big ideas. That's what we need going forward, and particularly the young people exciting their own generation first and foremost, and then the rest of Canadians.
Okay, and again, I hear what you're saying, but in your book, you do reference a few things that would make someone cynical, and these are your experiences from decades ago, let alone today when social media is involved. But you write in your book that always be aware, and this is some of the advice you give to young people thinking about going to politics. You write, always be aware of the political games and manipulation that political parties can play with nomination meetings. Absolutely. That's nomination alone. So has the current generation and the generation before just essentially ruined it for the next generation?
You know, it's become toxic. The relationship between the opposition and the government compared to my era has become very polarized. So yeah, I think parliamentary decorum has been the loser when oppositions go over the red line, and I was in opposition, and we had the Rat Pack, and they went way over the red line. So they helped energize our party, but again, political decorum has suffered. Now, for all the negativity, and it's a tough business to get in, but what I also point out in the book is that there's great satisfaction. You know, winning an election, entering cabinet, helping your constituents, moving pieces of legislation, meeting and working with fascinating people and traveling your country and getting to know your country better. In other words, we're very well aware of the negatives, but we have to strengthen the positives about public life. Because it was tough, but if it wasn't for the satisfaction, no one would stay. And people do stay because the moments of those great highlights overcome the downsides that you get, and it gives you the energy and the courage to continue. So there's lots of positives, and we've got to up the positives as opposed to just getting to know what the negatives are.
Okay, so what motivated you? Because you did very well in politics, and here you are out of politics, but still obviously making a contribution to this country. What inspired you to keep going on?
I became a community activist very early in life. My last year of high school and all through my university, I was in community affairs. I ran a newspaper, I ran a youth club, I ran a ratepayers association, and I loved changing our corner of the world modestly. And when I graduated as an urban planner, I said, I like to plan, but I love my community work more. What can I find that would bring me that kind of satisfaction? And politics, first and foremost, serves the community. And so I was very pleased in politics, and you got to develop a thick skin. That's the other thing I describe in the book. If you don't have a thick skin, then the arrows will kill you with time. And the toughest part of political life, I find, is not necessarily the politicians themselves, but their families, their mothers, their wives, their husbands, their kids. My mother always used to say, but why are they saying that? And I said, listen, Mom, it's not true, but this is part of democracy, and sometimes it doesn't look pretty.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't look pretty. But, you know, I was speaking recently to pollster Daryl Bricker and journalist John Ibbotson. They themselves have a new book out as well. And in this book, they reveal that 40% of Canadians under the age of 35 would be willing to join the United States. Young people willing to join the United States, and Daryl and John say that's an indication of Canada's failure to secure a future for those people. So when you hear that statistic and consider the call to arms that you essentially lay out in this book for young Canadians, what would you say to anyone who's thinking of getting involved in politics up against, I guess, this existential threat against not only the Canadian economy right now, but even the Canadian polity?
I find those stats frightening in terms of a pro-American bent because most Canadians that I bump into have no time for the president of the United States of America. And what I would say to Canadians, do you think that politics is tough? Yeah, it is. But it's a terribly exciting moment for all the crises that are surrounding us, both economically and politically, thanks to Donald Trump. But that's the very time when you want to jump in. In fact, I found some of the most fascinating moments was when we had a referendum in Quebec, when we had the issue of capital punishment, when we had the Meech Lake debate, when we had the free trade election. Lots of tension, lots of pressures. But man, you wouldn't want to be anywhere else except at the center of that political universe and trying to make a difference. That's what it's about. Making a difference, turning the corner, encouraging people to stand their ground, and let's build Canada and take our democracy to a higher level. Does it sound idealistic? Yeah. But when we think about public leadership, we got to think big.
The book is called Pursuing a Public Life, How to Succeed in the Political Arena. Some great practical tips and memories as well shared in this. Sergio Marchi, really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
And that was Michael Serapio's conversation with former Cabinet Minister Sergio Marchi. That's going to be all for this edition of Primetime Politics. For Michael and everyone here at CPAC, I'm Andrew Thompson. Thanks for watching. Have a great evening.